To those who would say yesterday, Mr. Rees Mogg, it was strong on sentiment and spirit, but short or light on detail, how would you react?
Well, the detail will be in the final points of the negotiations and in trade deals that we agree with other nations. The detail is also subject to Cabinet collective responsibility, and that hasn't yet been agreed. So I think it is important to remind people of the big vision of why we're leaving and what the aim is once we've left. The detail will come.
As and when we get that detail, as and when we get a deal, do we have another vote on it?
Well, we've had a vote to leave the European Union, so what would the next vote be on? That at the general election, the decision of the referendum was endorsed by the two main parties' manifestos, so I don't see that there would be grounds for another referendum unless a party wanted to reverse the decision to leave, in which case it should say so in its next election manifesto and then promise a referendum.
So no vote on the deal outright on its own?
Well, all you'd be voting on then is to say whether we leave the European Union with or without a deal. Right. And I'm not sure that that's a useful way of having a vote.
Boris Johnson is legally correct. There's a very good report by the House of Lords European Scrutiny Committee which set out that if we leave without a deal, under EU, international and UK law, we owe no money. And that's a very good starting point.
So without a deal, is
without a deal, that's right. So then you're saying, what is it in our interest to pay to get certain other elements that we want? But their starting negotiation position from the EU point of view is they have no legal basis for demanding these payments.
No, but they're saying that is the gateway to getting a deal, and you want a deal, don't you? Or would you like no deal?
They're saying a moral obligation. But a moral obligation ranks for less than a legal obligation.
No, but they're also saying that's how we can part as friends. I mean, what's your personal view? I mean, we have entered into obligations, haven't we?
The obligations cease on the day we leave the European Union. That's completely clear.
Even for programmes which are continuing to run?
If we want to maintain part of specific programmes, that's clearly different. The Erasmus programme, the Horizon 2020 programme, I have no difficulty with us continuing to contribute to those. There is then a negotiation on what Brexit looks like, and if money oils the wheels, we have it, they want it, but we should make sure we get a great deal in return for that.
Power grab by the executive. It's not giving power back to the sovereign parliament.
I think that's a misunderstanding of what's happening. This is a two-stage process. Currently, all those powers are with Brussels. They will come back to Westminster, and from there, I hope and expect many of them will be devolved, and that will be a matter of discussion between the devolved parliaments and the United Kingdom Parliament. And Parliament will then determine what laws are made in future, because as was established, yes it will.
If the secondary powers are used by the government,
secondary legislation always goes through Parliament. Now, sometimes, yes it does, even on a negative resolution, if enough MPs object to a secondary resolution...
Completely wrong. Sorry, Jacob.
The government cannot resist a prayer against...
Jacob, I'm sorry, I'm going to correct you, because in 2014-15, there were 19 prayers against, and not a single one led to a vote.
But the 19 prayers did not have a majority of Parliament praying against it.
So you've got to have a majority.
No,
that's the government.
No, what I'm saying is that for secondary legislation there always has to be either the tacit or implicit consent of Parliament.
But
that is always the case.
The only way you can assess whether there's the assent of Parliament is if you have a vote and a debate. And the government over the last 2 years simply hasn't been allowing us to do it.
If you've got 326 MPs to support a prayer against a negative instrument, you would find that there was a vote in Parliament invariably. As it happens, I do agree with you that the government should be more open to allowing prayers against the negative resolutions when signed by leading figures in the opposition.
Can I be helpful, and just to help? Sorry, could we conclude?
The British people have voted to leave. The House of Commons has voted to leave. Professor Grayling wants us to stay. I'm with the majority.
May I? Because this phrase, the British people, I do think it's the most terrific catchphrase. We're really talking about a quarter of the population when you sum up who that 37% of the restricted franchise was.
Well, I think this is such nonsense. The figure gets lower and lower for Professor Grayling's convenience. The British people voted in a fair election, and a majority voted to leave.
A minority
I think to call
of them
them the
did.
British people is extremely fair.
A minority of them did, and I have to say, with very great respect, that to see an old Etonian stockbroker on the far right of the Tory party representing himself as a tribune of the people, representing the interests of car workers in Sunderland, is mildly implausible.
Are you being Etonist?
What I want to say is that this referendum
that either
was
the
for...
Professor of the New College of the Humanities or I should throw stones at each other about our backgrounds.
Well,
Particularly.
let me say this, that it's not the people that Mr. Rees Mogg is representing, it's his people. Because the kind of Britain that he wants, a low-tax Britain, a Britain where there isn't enough money for the NHS and for state education and for welfare and for environmental protection.
If we don't give it to the EU.
Well, you want to privatise it. I mean, you don't use it, so you want to privatise it.
Privatise the NHS. I've never argued for the privatisation of the NHS. You're putting words into my mouth.
What does this word mean?
The act or habit of estimating as worthless.
Estimating something is worthless.
Yes. And what was the word? Just remind me.
Can you give me the Latin derivation?
Oh, well, no, not offhand.
Can't you? Why not? You use words and you can't give the proper derivation.
Well, I don't always have to give the etymology of every word I use, but I can pronounce it.
I mean, everyone knows it comes from flocci, meaning a whisper, a piece of wool, knocci, meaning a trifle, and nilai means nothing, and a pili, meaning a hair or something insignificant. I mean, it could have been flossio non facio. What does that mean?
I couldn't give a straw.
That's the literal interpretation.
I know, yes. If you were being rude, you might say I couldn't give a damn, but I wouldn't be so rude.
Why didn't you use the smaller one rather than the longer one?
I didn't think of it, actually. Floxinogi nihilipilification came to mind, as it does from time to time.
Does it often come to your mind?
It's one of those words I've known since I was a schoolboy.
When it comes to your mind, is there room for anything else in your mind?
Lots, and particularly pointing out that what we are wanting to indulge in the Floxinogi nihilipilification of, which is the European Court of Justice, which is the key point. That
Not the
judges,
European Court in Strasbourg.
No.
The one in Luxembourg.
The ECJ ruled to their own benefit that the pay rises of European officials had to go through, and that included their own pay. And this is against one of the most important principles of justice, that you should not be a judge in your own cause. And thankfully, using this odd word has got some attention to that tremendously important point of corruption in the law courts of Europe. And it's very important to get that point.
You made it in the Commons.
Sense of what Brexiteers make of today's announcement from the EU, I've been speaking to Jacob Rees Mogg, Conservative MP and chair of the European Research Group.
Well, it's their opening negotiating position, and we should negotiate back, because there are elements of it that I think are really very difficult for the government to accept.
Such as?
The free movement has to continue, and that the date for applying the rights of citizens will be the date of the end of the transition period rather than the 29th of March 2019, that we will be subject to the European Court of Justice, and perhaps the biggest risk is the ability of the EU to make new laws in the interim period.
But Michel Barnier in the press conference this afternoon was very clear that the 4 pillars must remain in place and there can be no à la carte version of membership as such.
Well, the whole point is that we're no longer members, and therefore we're not having the à la carte or the table to hot or whatever it is. We are leaving.
We are leaving, but he seemed to be very clear that the transition period itself was a privilege. That was the message he seemed to be giving. It was something the EU was allowing for everyone to smooth over the wrinkles that may come in the path of us leaving, and therefore it was their terms or no terms. That seemed to be very much the tone of his press conference.
Well, they want to get things ready from their own side as well. Bear in mind, we buy about £100 billion more of goods from them than they buy from us, and that this will be the first time since the Norman conquest that the UK has accepted rules imposed by a foreign power without having any say over them. That's a really big constitutional issue.
Downing Street today said there would naturally be differences between the sides, acknowledging some of the points that you've made ahead of the main negotiations. Are you satisfied by that as a response for now?
There are two key challenges for Downing Street. One is to set out what they want at the end of the transition. A transition to nowhere or to some unspecified destination is a plank rather than a bridge. That if we're not clear on where we're going, then we're not transitioning to anything. And that gap needs to be filled, and it needs to be filled as a matter of priority. And the second is we need to have clarity on the date of when transition ends. The EU has set a date of the 31st of December 2020, which is a very sensible date in my view. The government's talking vaguely about 2 years. The government now needs to set out what it wants and when it wants it. The truth is that to govern is to choose, and the government has to make choices. And inevitably, in making those choices, it will find some people aren't in favour of every choice that it makes.
On his Facebook page, the journalist Robert Peston said that Angela Merkel had journalists laughing uproariously about Theresa May and the way in which the Brexit negotiations are being conducted at a Davos briefing last week. Is there a danger that the government's becoming a laughingstock on Brexit with its inability, as you seem to be suggesting, to decide on what it wants at the end of all of this?
Well, I think this is quite historic. If a German chancellor has cracked a joke, I don't think that's ever happened before. The German sense of humour isn't so well known, I don't think.
Let's take that as a given, shall we?
What? The Germans have suddenly developed a sense of humour? Well, I congratulate them. They're becoming a bit more British, and that's a jolly good thing. No, I don't think that's right. Mrs. Merkel, perhaps she should look at her own position. Does she have a government yet? There might be a little bit to laugh about at her own position.
One last thought then about the Lords. The EU withdrawal bill heads to the Lords tomorrow. Some suggest that this is the most pro-EU Europhile bit of the House of Commons. What do you think that could mean for the Brexit process? Could it be held up further?
I think the leader of the Labour peers in the House of Lords, Baroness Smith, is a very sensible person. There are some other peers, Lord Adonis particularly, who want to tear up all the conventions. That would be a great risk and damaging to the House of Lords. But I think there are more sensible peers who will probably decide that the job of the Lords is to improve and revise, and that is probably